Welcome to this week's Ronin seminar featuring Gill Ragsdale, who is going to teach us everything we need to know about epigenetics.
Well, it's not epigenetics is part of the focus. As John knows, John met me when I was working on imprinting, as I think we both were in those days. I've moved a bit away from imprinting to more epigenetics in general. I moved more away into psychology and trauma and stress. And so what I've got today is some bits and pieces, partly about stress and focusing on the epigenetics really of stress in particular. So it's bits and pieces from several talks I'm supposed to give, some of which are for people with very little background knowledge, but I've put in a few more, just the odd little bit more technical bit, because I know there's a few people out there in my audience who are biologists and they'll be wondering if I know what the hell I'm talking about. So let's see how that goes. Now I'm going to try and get into sharing my screen. So I'm going to hit the button. And we're going to go to my desktop and we're going to get this one and we're going to share it. And then we're going to do a slideshow from the beginning. Right, is that working for everybody? Can you see
yes.
the...
Yes, we can see this nicely.
Yeah.
Okay, super. That's one thing over with. Excellent. So this is one of my I think I'm finding it quite distracting having my own video on it, but I can't turn it off now because I've done that. Never mind. It's one of my favorite photos. This, I don't know if anybody remembers it. It was a little girl, 4-year-old girl on the Syrian border, and the photographer was just trying to take a picture, and she assumed that he was trying to shoot her and just put her hands up. And this photo went around Twitter for a long time, and when you get to the end of the talk, you'll see particularly why I always keep this one to hand when I'm doing this kind of talk. So first of all, I'd just like to sort of recap a little bit what we mean by stress, because one of the problems with working on stress is that people can't really agree on what stress is quite from the beginning. And it's all sorts. It could be physical stress, it could be famine, it could be extreme and unpredictable weather, which is a bit topical really if you consider that's very stressful. Obviously predation, pain, lots of physical things in the environment also count as stress. Particularly relevant for mammals and particularly us, social stress. Now I've put a lot of women on here. Parenting stress in a modern environment, social isolation, social defeat, aggression, even watching somebody else being socially defeated and subject to aggression causes the same kind of vicarious stress response, even in rats, mice, and in humans as well. So we're very susceptible to not so much environment, but a lot of social stress. We're very susceptible to that kind of stress. We're very social animals, and a lot of you probably know that in primates, their cohesion in groups is all about grooming and picking at each other, and these female baboons are having a good grooming session here, and they find that the female baboons who have more grooming partners live longer and have more offspring, and their offspring are healthier. So for the biologists amongst you will know that this is the holy grail of saying that this is a successful trait, because it's all about fitness and having those kids and having plenty of healthy kids to carry on. So social bonding and grooming is a whole mammalian trajectory that can improve your fitness when it's working properly, which is good because it's very stressful living in groups, lots of competition, lots of aggression, competing for resources. So there's got to be a payoff as well. So now I'm not going to attempt to run this little video on here because we had a look at it the other day and the videos are not really too good. So stress is extremely costly. It damages your tissues, it damages your brain. It's very costly in terms of calories. It's expensive on fuel, and so you have to wonder if it's really worth it. And of course, I don't know about you, but I've spent idle minutes cruising YouTube and actually watching real footage of people who have been chased by bears. There's quite a lot of them actually when they're out, because people cycle with their head cams and things on. And so if you ever feel like doing it, you'll find there's quite a few out there. and they're cycling along, and then all of a sudden, they're being chased by a bear, and you can really feel it. You sense that they're speeding up a bit, they're breathing harder, their heartbeat's going, so that's all the stress response kicking in. And if they didn't have the stress response, they might just amble along and just not care, and the bear would just eat them. And that wouldn't be very good. So it does have its uses. But this fight or flight that everyone's familiar with is very, very male dominated. It's a really male dominated research area, and people got wise to that, especially female researchers, and said, it's not all about fight or flight. We also have something called tend and befriend. Tend and befriend, it tends to be a more female response. So when you're in trouble and you're stressed, you're looking to take care of people around you who are vulnerable, like your children or dependents, really children, and look to other people to support you, usually, I have to say, other women. And we think it's very much based in the hormone, the release of oxytocin, and it probably has its roots in childbirth and the use of oxytocin in response in childbirth and caring for children. So we have these two quite different responses to stress. And it's very, 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 very ancient, this response to stress. The earliest, 600 million years ago, you find some of the molecular roots in this little flatworm, Echiolium or something it's called. I mean, they freeze, they pretend to be dead, they do some of the same things. One thing that we do as humans that animals don't do, we don't tend to feign death. We can train ourselves to feign death, but what we do instead is we faint. It's a fainting, so we just lose consciousness, which is very human specific. It's quite unusual. So you've got fight and flight, you've got tend and befriend, and you also have this fainting and freezing. So there's quite a few different things going on there. They're all useful to do with stress. And some of you might have heard in the literature, there's a lot of talk about whether our current stress response is still adaptive today. There's this very popular paleo anthropological movement. You've probably seen the paleo diet and all sorts of things. And people are saying, well, modern life is so stressful. And back in the Stone Age, we didn't have all this stress that we have in modern life. So, probably we're all stressed and we're getting ill because we're stressed because our modern life is so stressful. And you have to think, well, is that really true? Because, and there's a lot of talk about archetypal needs. If you look in evolutionary psychiatry, what are the archetypal needs from our evolutionary ancestry, what we call the environment of human evolutionary adaptiveness? What were we actually living in for most of our life? And perhaps our real needs are in those kinds of environments instead of today's environments. And people say, well, it seems that our normal environment until quite recently in human history, in the last sort of few thousand years, which is nothing, a few thousand years is nothing. We lived in kinship groups of 40 to 50, not completely random groups. They would have been largely through groups of extended kin. Very, very frequent contact, often meeting up with other groups for trade. You can see that in the Stone Age records. You can see that people did meet up for trades, pretty much like a lot of nomadic groups do now, and a lot of exchange going on. I live in a little village. There's about 4,000 people in my village, and there's definitely insiders and outsiders. I don't know. There were people who were here, their parents were here, and if you're not in that, if you were like me and you came in, oh man, you're not in that. You're not in that group. And just an example of how of some of the modern stresses that people talk about. One of the worst stresses, apparently, is documented, is noise stress. It's apparently the commonest form of when people complain about the workplace injuries, ongoing problems with health. It's the commonest thing that people are afflicted with, especially in the Western world, is noise stress. They find that your stress hormone response can be altered. Children's responses are altered if they live in areas of heavy traffic where there's constant traffic noise. And there's a feeling amongst a lot of people who study stresses and like this, that we don't even know what might be triggering our stress. I mean, someone did this study with these tigers at a zoo in America and found that they went for, I can't remember, how far was it? They went for about, how many miles? It was like 24 miles, or they were really long distance, miles and miles. They were going through. The sound of these tigers were making was we almost didn't register. We couldn't register it consciously with our hearing, but it was passing through mountains and stuff like this, and other animals obviously could hear it. So there's a lot of stuff going on. We don't even know sometimes what the triggers are out there for us. So there's this feeling that modern stress is very difficult, and some of you might have seen this has given birth to this whole kind of movement of paleotherapy, and this all sounds like common sense really. So this guy's making a nice living doing advocating that we have something which can throw back to our time in our evolutionary history when we had omega-3 fatty acids, because there's very good evidence that at one point now, modern evolutionary history in modern humans, we spent a lot of time trailing around the coastlines, eating a lot of fish and seafoods and things. And you can see actually in the skull record that there are traces of in the skull. You can see that we did in fact have more of these fatty acids in the brain. So they're not making it up. It is true. More sunlight, exercise, socializing, don't ruminate, and get good sleep. Sounds really, really obvious, and they did it and they said, oh yeah, people feel better. It's not rocket science. So this is kind of where this movement is going. But we're wondering, so that it gives you the idea, so the people are going really banging on a bit about the fact that chronic stress is a new problem, but is chronic stress a new problem? And I think we're going to have a look at that, and it's not so much that chronic stress is a new problem so much as the quality, the types of the stress are different. So we've got a lot more social stresses, especially in Western developed worlds. There are parts of the world where, frankly, they still have a lot of the other kinds of stress. But now, the kind of place where you and I probably are living most of the time, the kind of stresses that are really up in our environments are parenting pressures. We parent in isolation with a lack of support. We've got social isolation, really intense status competition. Can't overemphasize how obsessed with status primates are in general. So, and we have we're competing massed here. We've got social media, we've got TV, that the sense of competition for status is very intense. And unfortunately, because of that, you would experience social defeat quite regularly. Whenever you feel you've come off worse about something, or you're not good enough about something, or you apply for a job, you didn't get it, or, something like this, that social defeat, it has an effect on your stress system, and it's not good. And the main reason, though, that we know for sure that chronic stress really is not new is that we do have a mechanism for it. We know that there's a mechanism for chronic stress because we know that when you experience stress early in your life, it seems to program your stress response for the rest of your life. So the fact that we're able to do that tells you that chronic stress is not a new thing. This is something all mammals are able to do, and we are still doing it. Even though it's quite a costly thing to do, we still do it. And so if you have early life stress, we know that later in life, you get this whole suite of problems: anxiety, depression, antisocial behavior, conduct disorder, and all these other things, which we have new names for now, but basically you get the idea. And when we're looking at this, people think, well, okay, how much is this to do with the environment? How much is this to do with shared genes? Where is this coming from? Because your stress response comes and goes. Your hormones go up, they come down. How is it possible that something that happens in your early years can still be affecting you when you're 20 or 30 or 40 or 50? It is quite a conundrum to know how is that possible in a system which is supposed to be reactive and labile. So one of the earliest studies done was in the Second World War. There was a siege in Holland. It was basically the fault of everybody, the Germans and the Europeans. The poor people they were deadlocked. The winter froze over, and they had what's called the Dutch hunger winter. It's quite an interesting period of history in its own right. And it was real starvation. And it was like a natural experiment, because these people were just ordinary people who were perfectly well nourished. And then overnight, suddenly, as you can see on the graph, very suddenly, the calories went down, and people were getting the kind of calories that would barely keep a 2-year-old alive. About 20,000 people died. Audrey Hepburn there, she was a teenager, and she always blamed her later problems with depression and mood swings on her experiences through the Dutch hunger winter. So people studied pregnant women, people who were pregnant during the Dutch hunger winter, and looked at their children compared to those who came later or before, but were otherwise in the same circumstances. And they found that those children were programmed for famine. They were programmed to really store the carbohydrates and fats, and so they often became quite obese. They had health problems, heart problems. They followed them for many, many years, and they found they didn't just have these physical problems, they also had mental health problems as well. So because of course it wasn't just physically stressful, it was stressful in every way, and they had a whole suite of problems. This was the early ideas that you get this kind of what we call fetal programming for stress. And so when the children that were born after the famine was over, but when they were born, they were already programmed. They'd been programmed in the womb. But the people still didn't really know how it happened. How is it possible? So we go fast forward quite a long way up to about the 1980s, and we're looking at, someone was looking at rats. It was Michael Meany, and quite a few people were looking at rats, and they'd been breeding rats for a long time and looking at the offspring and watching their behavior quite closely. And one of the things that people noticed, and Meany certainly noticed, was that some rat mothers behaved differently. Some rat mothers licked and groomed their mice a lot. They're nice mothers. And some of them didn't really. They were a bit anxious and kind of didn't groom them, didn't lick them so much. And the ones that didn't lick their pups so much, when those pups were older, they became quite anxious. Let me see what's on my next. Yeah, we do want my next one. If you wonder what an anxious mouse looks like, this is what an anxious mouse looks like. In the open field test, an anxious mouse will cling to the corners and the sides, like going to a party and not being able to get away from the wall or from the edge of the kitchen or something. They won't go into the open area because some predator is going to come and get them if they do that. They're anxious. And mothers who are less attentive have these mice that are more anxious, and they become more anxious. For their whole life, they're more anxious, and they are more anxious mothers. And not surprisingly, when they're more anxious mothers, they have more anxious offspring. So there's this cycle going on, and they wondered, well, how is this possible? What is going on here? Is it genes or is it environment? What is going on here? So they cross-fostered the rat pups and gave the pups from the high interaction mother to pups mothers that were neglectful, and vice versa. And you found that when they were cross-fostered, this did have an effect. So if you crossed them over, the rats that got a lot of licking and grooming became less anxious, even if their mother had been anxious. Now, on the face of it, that sounds, perfectly like an environmental thing, isn't it? That sounds like it's a purely environmental effect, because it's the behavior of the mother licking and grooming the mouse. But it does raise a whole other issue. How is that possible? How is it possible that being licked and groomed changes the stress response of these pups for the rest of their life? They leave their mothers. They're not like us. They're not like us and humans, where you get landed with your kids for like the rest of your life. You never get rid of them. These are gone. But the rest of their life, they will carry this mark in their whole system is set differently, depending on whether they were licked and groomed by the parental mouse. So this was Meany really wondered about this. He wondered, how is it remotely possible? So if we have a really quick look at the stress response, I don't want to get too bogged down in it. But the thing I just wanted to, the only thing I want really to notice here is that you've got a cascade, you've got hormones being released. And remember very much that stress is what we feel. Stress is not the event. Stress is when you respond by releasing these stress hormones, that's when you're stressed. If you suppress that, you're not stressed. But this feeling of stress is actually you. It's your biology. It's your stress response that makes you feel stressed. So we're doing it to ourselves all the time. So you release cortisol, is at the end game here. You've got cortisol, and you don't want it in your system all the time, or you'll just stay stressed all the time. You need to get it out. And so you've got these receptors in the brain, glucocorticoid receptors in the brain, that mop up this cortisol. And then you feel better. Your stress response calms down and you're fine. So the more of these receptors you have, the quicker your stress subsides and you get over it. And if the stressor doesn't keep going on, that's it, it's all over. So it's quite good to be mopping this up if you don't want to stay too stressed all the time. It'll make you calmer and less anxious. So our researcher over in Canada, Mr. Michael Meany, he couldn't understand. He could see that something, he could see that when he looked at these mice and he looked at the brains, he could see that the mice that were most easily stressed had fewer of these receptors in the brain. But he couldn't think for the life of them, how is that remotely possible? How can licking a rat mean that it's got fewer glucocorticoid receptors in its brain? Now, glucocorticoid receptor is a protein, and it has a gene that codes for it. So he figured out that something was somehow turning this gene up and down, but he still couldn't figure out how is that possible, because you're just licking the rat. And I think there's a quite nice tie-in with the whole Ronin situation, actually, because John and I were just saying how, you know, when you're in the same department, you run into people automatically and you form collaborations. Well, this guy, Meany, he was working at McGill in Canada, and he was at a conference in Madrid in Spain. And at the bar, he met someone who also worked at McGill in Canada. He was a cancer researcher, but he'd never met him before. They met in Spain at this conference. So they didn't meet. They could have met any day, but they didn't. And Meany was telling him about this problem. And the other guy said, well, I've been researching this process that turns genes on and off called epigenetics. And what you do, and I might have to go back and forwards if they'll let me. If we go forwards for a minute, what happens is you just put this tiny little chemical, really small, just put this little tiny methyl group, it's a tiny little thing, onto one of your DNA bases at the beginning of a gene, and it can switch it off or on, usually off. And then is anybody want to interrupt or tell me to go slower or faster? It's not faster, I tend to go too fast actually. So they said, okay, we know that this happens in cancer, we know this happens in growth, but we don't really people didn't think it happened generally through the lifetime. They didn't think it was a general mechanism. People didn't believe it at all, in fact. And they got together and thought, well, you know what? Maybe it is. Maybe this is what's happening. So they got together. We go back. So they got together and they tested it, and they found this is exactly what was happening. So if we go forward for a minute, what you found is when the rat mums lick the babies, that starts a train through serotonin and other things, a biochemical chain of things, which takes those methyl groups off this glucocorticoid receptor gene. So they come off. So the default, they're born. These pups are born in the high for stress. They're born as if the world's going to be very stressful, and this gene is switched off. And as they're licked and groomed, that's like a message from the mom saying, do you know what? The world's actually quite a nice place. I'm feeling happy and relaxed. I've got time to lick and groom you. I'm not stressed. You know, it's fine. Everything's fine. Let's switch this gene back on. Let's get some glucocorticoid receptors into your brain. Let's mop up your cortisol so that when you get stressed, you don't get stressed for very long. You're not particularly anxious, and you can just, you know, you might go out into an open field, feel a little bit of stress. There's nothing there, nothing around the corner. Calm down and just go out and get your food and find some boy mice and, you know, do all those things, and it'll be fine. So this is actually what was happening. It was a very controversial paper. A lot of people didn't believe it, but there have been a few more things. A lot of people actually still aren't quite sure about it, but there is a lot more research now to show that this does actually happen. And one of the big connections, of course, is this is a behavior causing this. This isn't just this isn't just something in your diet, which is almost understandable. It's not a chemical. This is licking and grooming a mouse is causing this chemical change, this epigenetic change. Epigenetics being a way that you can regulate genes without changing the DNA itself. I mean, it's loosely speaking. So there was the immediate thing that everybody wondered, and you'll probably, if you haven't heard of this before, you'll be thinking everybody thought was, oh my God, does this happen to people? I mean, obviously we don't lick and groom exactly, but is this happening? Because we know that early stress and child abuse are related, that they somehow modify the stress response throughout life. Is it the same mechanism? As you can imagine, it's very hard to show that. But somebody happened to have a sample. He was studying depression and suicide for some other reason. And somebody had 37 brains from suicides to put towards this study. And he was able to look at the brains from a control group, people, and he had because he'd been studying suicide and depression, he had all the life history and everything, so he could do this. And he had a group of brains that were just dead through other causes. He had a group who had committed suicide that had no kind of history of any kind of abuse. And then he had a whole sample that had committed suicide, and it was documented that they'd suffered some kind of child abuse. And as you can see, what they found was that the glucocorticoid receptors in the genes of the people who had been abused was different to the others, the ones that had been abused in childhood. So it wasn't the fact that they'd been depressed and anxious and committed suicide. It was what made the difference was that they had had this early life stress. They'd suffered abuse as children, and it did suggest. I mean, obviously, this is not something that's replicated very much, but it did suggest that the same mechanism that we're seeing in mice and rats may well be happening in humans. So that was quite a bit. And then people started looking at other genes and found, you know what, this is happening all over, and it seems to happen a lot in the brain. The brain is of all the different tissues and places where this could be happening, the brain is a hotspot for this kind of changing gene expression depending on the experiences that you have, like stress. So, for example, we've got this miracle chemical, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which I can't get right. Look at that; it's still saying BNDF. I just can't seem to call it BDNF. I just can't do that. But it should be BDNF, obviously. Brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It's a miracle thing. It actually is this thing where we now know that your neurons can repair and grow through life. We used to think that was impossible. Now we know it is possible, and it's partly due to this chemical in the brain. But stress and aging switch that gene off. So if you're very stressed, your capacity for repairing and growing neurons in your brain is switched off, which is not very good news. It's enough to make you stressed, actually, just thinking about it, which is a bit unfortunate. And one of my favorites, the oxytocin, they call it the love chemical. That is also epigenetically regulated quite strongly. Licking and grooming, again, you will have more estrogen receptors. You will make more estrogen. It means you make estrogen is the big thing for being social. Oxytocin decreases the amygdala's response to fear. So you have less social stress. In fact, you can buy oxytocin on the internet, especially in the States. People sell it and they market it as a thing to attract, for men to attract women, or to increase their trust, to make people trust you. You can spray it and it's supposed to make people trust you. And some of you should try looking for these ads. They are quite amazing. I should have put a couple in, actually. So it's supposed to have this powerful effect on decreasing social stress. So obviously, if you are stressed and you decrease over the lifetime the amount of oxytocin you're making, you are decreasing your resistance to social stress. You're decreasing the likelihood of you being pro-social. So you're causing quite a strong line of behaviors over your lifetime there. Attachment. If you've got the stress reactivity, you've got from childhood, neglect and abuse, it affects your attachment styles as a parent and a partner over your lifetime. So it can, it has some quite, so there's quite a range of effects on your behavior and your emotional life and your social behavior as a result of this early programming of stress on several. These are just a few of the hormones and chemicals. There's quite a lot of things that are affected, but these are some of the main ones that are affected by stress and then affect your mental health and behavior. We think that socioeconomic stress influences epigenetic. There's been some fantastic stuff done on people born in the 50s who were born into poverty and people who were born into wealthier environments. Interestingly, it's being born in the poverty. You can change, but they looked at people whose circumstances change later in life, and that doesn't really have the kind of effect we're looking for. It's that early period. So people who were born in the lowest socioeconomic bracket had global methylation, because you can't take people's brain and look at for stuff like that. They just did a global, right, how methylated is your genome, and they found it was more methylated when you had poverty, basically. And you can do that with mice. Mice think poverty is being crowded and if you crowd mice too much for the same resources, they get stressed. That's their idea of poverty. And you can definitely see that you get this methylation of the genes that we're talking about, and a global methylation as well. So we think there may be socioeconomic implications. A lot of people are looking a lot at social policy implications for some of this research. And just in case you think, I mean, people tend to think this is through pregnancies through the female line, but actually it's not just through the female line. There's all sorts of things popping up. Stressed male rats also have more, can pass it on through the sperm. There's often sex differences in all these things. You get in the sons, you get delayed learning, slower brain maturation, and more risk taking. And the daughters, you get impaired learning. So you get this, the fathers can pass it on also. Fascinating study done. There's cherry blossom the smell of cherry blossom is associated with a very particular chemical for which there is a receptor in the mouse brain, probably in us as well. And if you make a male rat afraid of the smell of cherry blossom, his children and grandchildren are also afraid of the smell of cherry blossom. So this is, it just shows you the potential for what can be passed on. I mean, this is a very unusually specific example, but just shows you what can happen. The I mean, some really interesting things. The Y chromosome, which is only present in a male mouse, male person, male anything, can influence non-Y carrying daughters. And I'm not going to get into how that is. That's quite complicated, but that is a really interesting. So they can pass on the stress to their daughters, and that influence is still from the Y chromosome. And just to show you the potential of the kind of specific things that can happen, male rats taking cocaine have sons that are resistant to use. And that's actually quite different to humans because they tend to be more susceptible. So this is also shows you how things can be different. You have to be a bit careful. Extrapolating from, there's a long gap between a mouse and a human, and very little done in primates. And I can't say I disapprove of that. I'm not a great fan of doing this kind of thing on primates. There's not a lot done. So one of the things that's fascinating here is the fact that, for example, if you've got a female, you're FC, or you've got a female parent that's stressed, that stress affects her. It affects the embryo that she has, that she's carrying. Now, when you're any mammal embryo that's growing, as it grows inside the womb, the eggs for that daughter's children are already in that child. So as you affect that female who's pregnant, you affect not only her F1 child, you also affect the F2 grandchild. You can do that in one hit. One hit of stress can hit 3 generations in one go. The big controversy is whether or not it can go to a 4th generation, and that is a really controversial issue that people are still looking at. In fact, they're mainly looking at it in male mice because it's easier to separate these things out. When you hit, if you stress that father, you're stressing, he can pass that through his sperm to his children. Can you also pass it on an extra generation? And that's, people are looking very hard at that to see whether that is happening. And you've got this multi-generational effect of stress across and down the generations. And so the big factors here is, how widespread it is, how persistent across generations is it, and also what do you do about it? The good thing about epigenetics is the whole point of it is that it's reversible. That's the whole point. It's not permanent. You haven't altered your genes. It's permanent. You put that methyl group on, and you put it on by experience. You can take it off again. So how do you do that? And you're supposed to be able to do that. So we must have in history, all mammals and humans as well, have had periods of really intense stress. It might have been violence. It might have been, we think, probably very rapid climate change, for example. And so you've got famine, you've got stress, you've got violence probably over the resources. And so you set and train this long-term response to this intense and chronic stress until times are better and you can put it back again. And it's, for example, this has evolved completely separately in plants, and it's very, very well documented in plants, and they have a long memory of stress, and they have quite a complex and quite sophisticated responses of the same kind to stress from the environment. So you end up with this situation where you've got the grandma has stress and her genome's being methylated, and then her daughter's anxious, and now her genes are being methylated because, of course, if anxiety, the behaviors that come around with anxiety tend to have a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, especially when you're talking about social stress. I mean, the environmental stress can come and go, but we've got the behavioral changes that result are down to us switching it on and off, and that is a whole other problem. And a lot of work has been done with populations. I work a lot with refugees, been working a lot with refugees in the last couple of years, so I have a big interest in this idea of what happens when you get whole populations who are really traumatized, and what happens to their health, and what happens in terms of intervention. What do you do? So people have looked at Holocaust survivors, the Rwandan genocide, quite a few of the things like this, and they found that the women who were pregnant during the Rwandan genocide, their glucocorticoid genes are more methylated. Their children, the genes are more methylated. So this does seem to be something you can imagine. This isn't just if you haven't got just one or two children in a household here and there who are stressed or have been abused. You've got now entire populations and generations who have all been programmed for extreme stress. I mean, I think I'm fascinated by what that means in terms of cultural evolution. What does it mean in terms of a culture, and what can be done about it? You find that women who have had what you call intimate partner violence have been studied, and you find that it doesn't affect their genes because they're adults so much, but their children at 10 and 19 years of age, as adolescents, the methylation of their genes is affected because their mothers were victims of violence while they were pregnant and while they were in early childhood. And so you end up with, these sort of antisocial behaviors, tendencies to aggression in males, extreme anxiety, things which are. And I think one of the other things that's fascinating is that once somebody has been programmed for an environment of extreme stress, they're not really adapted to a non-stress environment. I think that's a really important thing for people to understand, is trying to put somebody who's adapted to high stress and think that they're just going to live happily and normally when you take all that stress away. I'm afraid that is probably not going to happen for a lot of people. A lot of people actually will find that very uncomfortable and quite difficult to deal with. So what can you do about it? Well, a healthy parenting bond, first line of defense if you can. But that also means that perhaps the interventions have to start really early. I mean, having interventions because you think people are not coping as parents when the kids are already up at school, or you really missed the boat. And so people who are vulnerable and starting out as families and parents, that's where they need the support, and you need a lot more support for young people going into parenting. Adopted and maltreated children more vulnerable to harsh parenting. So some children who've already had a bad experience, if they experience more any kind of harsh parenting, actually, I mean, we know when we deal with children with trauma that you really have to go easy on some of the things you would consider to be quite ordinary disciplinary measures. You have to think very carefully about what you're going to do. Prenatal stress, I mean, for this, it puts an awful lot of weight on the mother's behaviour here, which is it's enough to make you stressed. But prenatal stress or postnatal stress can be countered when the mother, if the mother is supported and her mood improves, her attachment tends to improve and everything can be turned around if it happens in that window. If you're still operating within this developmental window, you can turn it around. So that's the good news there. Intervention is at that time can be very effective. People are looking at diet interventions for all sorts of things that because there's a lot of disease research on epigenetics. I'm looking at stress in particular, but there's a lot of cancer and disease, Alzheimer's, all sorts of things. And there are foods which are methyl donors in people. And unfortunately, I'm sorry to say, but alcohol seems to be out. That breaks my heart. Like green tea I quite like. I'm a bit sorry about to see the alcohol. Alcohol is a terrible global demethylator. It really breaks my heart, actually. And it's a lot of drug. There's a load of people in the pharmaceutical industry researching this. But unfortunately, actually, some of the drugs that are already on the market are now being found to have epigenetic effects, and they've been being used, like some of these antidepressants, like fluoxetine, which I think we call Prozac usually. And a lot of these are, they actually have epigenetic effects, not just methylation. There are other kinds of epigenetic effects I haven't gone into. And we didn't even know that was happening. People have got these drugs in the market for years, and now we're finding they actually have opposite effects depending on when you get them. So there's a lot going on out there in the drug world already that we don't really understand, which is a little bit scary. So, I'd be a bit wary about trying to alter the methylation status of your genome just like that, because you don't really know what the knock-on effects, the pleiotropic effects are. A little methylation, like a lot of things in genetics, is a bit of a U shape. You want to be in the happy middle, the Goldilocks zone. You don't really want anything at the extreme ends. I'm very interested in the idea of experience and behavior. If experience and behavior caused this, can experience and behavior get you out of this fix? And certainly there's a lot of research that shows that it can. When you give mice who have been stressed by their mothers an enriched environment and lots of novelty, they improve. They're much better. Incidentally, they will refuse drugs as well, just to throw that in. But we always used to think, oh yes, we're addicted because you give rats drugs and they get addicted. Well, they do, but if you give them other things to do, they don't get so addicted. And it's the same with the stress. You give them plenty to do, you make them happy and not bored, and they're much better. And it works also for the mothers-to-be if you do the same with the the pregnant mice who are anxious. Everything seems to improve. And stress, with exercise is weird because exercise is stressful. So exercise used properly can be quite beneficial as long as you're within certain parameters. And I mean, forced swim is used to stress mice and rats. But if you give them a bit of swimming and expose them to novelty, their hormone levels, they look like they're less depressed. You have to imagine, you can tell when, apparently, when rats and mice are depressed, and their hormones and their behavior show that they seem to be less depressed. So there are all these interventions that can work if they're applied, and you can get them to people. It's not that easy though. There's a huge renewed interest in psychotherapy as an epigenetic drug. Because it's about, for those of you, I've done a lot of counseling. One of the overriding messages we say about therapy is it doesn't matter what school of therapy you're going to. It doesn't matter what school of therapy your therapist's in. If you get on with your therapist and you form a good social bond with your therapist, you will probably benefit, because actually that's the main thing. It is like, here, it is the equivalent of your dog licking your face till you feel good about yourself. A good therapist can create that kind of containment that is a bit like if you're doing this and trying to cognitive behavioral therapy, where you're trying to change your thought processes. I always say it's a bit like trying to lick your own brain. You're trying to lick your own brain and change, and there is some idea. It's not quick because you're outside the developmental window, but there is evidence that these things can operate over the lifespan. Unfortunately, there does seem to be a concentration in this developmental window, so you probably have to try a lot harder. It's a bit like losing weight. It's a lot harder to lose it. It's much easier to put it on than it is to lose it. It's a bit like this. It's much easier when you've experienced that early stress to be programmed for stress. the intervention to get rid of it, the longer you leave it, the later you have that intervention, the harder it is. So just some final thoughts on this, things I'm interested in. So the stress response works best as an acute response, an emergency response, but it's very, very, very expensive. And if you carry on too long, it really is very expensive, and it will cause you a lot of damage. And some of the stresses that we are reacting to, it's probably not worth it. You're not in a situation where it's probably not being that helpful, because they're mainly social stresses, and they're mainly actually under our control. They're not external stresses that we have no control over. But it's probably not new. Chronic stress, I think it's a mistake for people to say it's not new, because we are adapted for it. But biology, of course, is not about happiness. It's about fitness. So when you're under a lot of stress, you just need to get on. They just want you to get out there. They don't want you to hide behind a rock and not do anything. They want you to get out there and fight for your piece of bread and have kids, even if it makes you miserable. Frankly, it doesn't matter. You can be nasty, Brutus, and short. You've got to get on with it. But in good times, you can sit back and invest, be sociable, be less aggressive, be less anxious, be more trusting. And so the trick is how to get off the treadmill if you've got when you've got really massive quantities, whole groups of people, whether it's in a subpopulation within one environment or a whole population somewhere else, and they're all programmed into this vicious cycle of stress. What kind of interventions can we have that would really cut this off at the knees, rather than trying to? Quite often, a lot of the things that are done are really about looking after real basics, and coming at this really much too late in the day and not really addressing something which is just going to perpetuate this on and on and on forever. And that's kind of it, really.